Hey everybody, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the scapula today. I'm not sure why exactly, but this was always one of the most interesting bones to me when I was learning anatomy, and it's probably one of my most favorite bones to teach. It's a pretty unique bone. If you take a look at it, it's one of the two bones that make up what's called our pectoral girdle. So it's these two structures here, the clavicle and the scapula, that are responsible for supporting your arm, for supporting your upper extremity. Actually, the only bone-on-bone attachment of your entire upper extremity to your axial skeleton is right here. It's just this tiny little articulation between the clavicle and the manubrium. It's called the sternoclavicular joint. So that seems odd, given what our arms are used for, to carry heavy objects, to lift ourselves up, or uh, hold things, pull on things. You would think they'd have a lot of bony attachment to our axial skeleton like our lower extremity does. If you look at your lower extremity, you have this really big femoral head sitting in what's called your acetabulum, this deep socket that's connected directly to your spine through the SI joint. That makes a lot of sense. It looks very stable. The shoulder doesn't look as stable, and it isn't. But despite that, it still is a remarkably stable connection, even given this one little uh, bony attachment. And the reason that is we have a ton of musculature in and around our shoulder, and a lot of those muscles attach to our scapula in some shape or form. And it's those muscles that sort of give it its interesting shape, and its shape and function go hand in hand. So we're going to take a look at the angles and the borders of the scapula in another video. So we're just going to go ahead and dive right into the different structures of the scapula right off the bat. So the first structure we'll label is called the acromion, or the acromial process. And it's right here. So if you were to sort of tap on the top of your shoulder, you feel this hard, bony plate that prevents you really from touching the head of your humerus. And that's nice. It kind of gives your humerus some protection superiorly, so nothing can knock it and do damage to these structures. Let's get another view from the top. So there it is, the acromion from a superior view. And you can see that there's a portion of it that attaches to the clavicle, and that will be our next structure. It's called the clavicular facet. So if we remove the clavicle, and this is a really fun one to see on a real bone as well, because it's actually really easy to see. It's this smooth surface right here, and that's called the clavicular facet, and it articulates with the clavicle. And the part of the clavicle it articulates with is called the acromial facet. So that kind of makes sense. It's named for what it touches. Let's go back to a posterior view here. And we see what we refer to as the shoulder blade. In layman's terms, we see this structure right here, which is called the spine of the scapula. Right there. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. And we're going to label some parts of the spine of the scapula. So the whole thing is called the spine. The middle portion, this area, is called the crest. And if you can tell, really the crest is wider than just that line. It goes all the way up to there and all the way down to here. It's this whole flat area facing posteriorly. But you can see that there's a lip. So there's a lip on the top and a pretty sharp lip on the bottom. So the flat surface is called the crest, but the lips have their own name. So this would be the inferior lip and the superior lip. And a lot of times in anatomy, you kind of wonder, like, okay, what was the point of naming these things? What do they do? Why do I need to know about them? So when we start talking about muscles, you will see that each of these is an attachment. So a certain muscle attaches to the inferior lip, to the crest, to the superior lip. Certain muscles attach to different aspects of the acromion. Everything we name for the most part has a purpose. Some things I think just got named because they look interesting, but for the most part, structure equals function. So if we're naming something, if we're pointing something out, it's because it has a role to play in some shape or form. So now we have some fossae. So you can see there's a lot of smooth surfaces on the scapula, and most of these, I'm trying to think of potentially all of these, well, no, most of these are muscle origins or muscle attachments at least. So if we're looking at a posterior view, we can see two really large smooth surfaces. You can see one right here. It's below the spine. And then we can see one up here. We'll look at a different view for that too. But we can see one right here above the spine of the scapula. So this inferior one is called the infraspinous fossa, and the superior one is called the supraspinous fossa. That makes an awful lot of sense when you look at their relationship to the spine. So the infraspinous fossa is below, the supraspinous fossa is above. And later we'll find out that the muscles are even named for these attachments. So the muscle that originates here and connects to the humerus is called the infraspinatus, and the muscle that attaches here and connects to the humerus is called the supraspinatus. So that's kind of nice. Both of these structures are posterior, and you're looking for the spine of the scapula and then the relation of these fossae to the spine, and that will help you remember their names. If we go around to the front view, let's hide everything else. Oops. So if we look anteriorly, we can see this really big fossa. And this is called the subscapular fossa, and the muscle that attaches here is called subscapularis. So those are three pretty big and obvious structures. You might be surprised though, it's easier than you might think to mess these up. I see a lot of people calling the infraspinous fossa the subscapular fossa or vice versa. I think because they're just both big triangular shaped fossa. But remember, the infraspinous fossa is below the spine of the scapula. The subscapular fossa, you're not going to see the spine. So the subscapular fossa is pointing anteriorly. The infraspinous fossa is pointing posteriorly. I love the name of this structure. It's actually not that accurate, to be honest, on the app from what I'm used to seeing. It's called the smooth triangular space, and in real life it looks even more triangular than it does here, but this is still pretty good. And every scapula is different. So there's a smooth triangular space here. There is a muscle that attaches anteriorly underneath this. It just is named this because it's a smooth triangular space, so that's what we call it. We have two notches. We have a notch here. That's called the greater scapular notch. If we're looking at a lateral view, it's this notch right here. And then from a superior view, you can see it as well. Right there, greater scapular notch. We have another notch called the lesser scapular notch, or you can also call it the suprascapular notch. It's right here. Now in the body, there's a ligament that goes over here, and this is an area where nerves and vessels can travel. But anyway, again, we're just naming the notch. That's the lesser scapular notch, and that's the greater. All right, our next structure is called the coracoid process, not to be confused with the coronoid process or the conoid tubercle or the other coronoid process. This is coracoid. It's very prominent. It's just a pretty easy structure to see there. The acromion is more posterior. The coracoid process is more anterior, and you can actually palpate this on yourself. Let's add everything back in. If you just kind of, well, one, if you've already been able to find your acromion, you can use that as a reference. But maybe easier would be to sort of find your AC joint. So if you can find that little connection between your clavicle and your acromion, you might need to move your shoulder around, and you can sort of feel that connection there. You can feel your clavicle sort of moving up and down. And if you just kind of fall off the front of your shoulder and move down, you might need to move a little bit medial. You're going to feel a bump here, and you're going to notice it's pretty tender. You have some nerves running here. You also have a lot of muscle attachments. So this whole process is just covered in muscle attachments. And if your posture is not the best and some of these muscles are sort of shortened, like maybe your pec minor is tight, they're going to be a little tender. But anyway, give it a shot. See if you can find this process on yourself. Again, that's called the Coracoid process. The neck of the scapula, you wouldn't think the scapula would have a neck since it doesn't have a head. You know, if you look at the humerus, for example, here's the head. Okay, it would make sense that, you know, this is its neck. There's also another neck here. We'll talk about that later. The scapula doesn't have a head, but it does have a neck. So if you picture this being the head, now I know it's the head of the humerus, but still, if you picture that being the head, then you might imagine this area would be the neck, and that's the case. The neck of let's look from the front. The neck of the scapula is right here, and it goes around both sides. So that is the neck, scapular neck. Okay. The glenoid fossa is where the head of the humerus attaches, somewhat pear-shaped. It's right here, and that is called the glenoid fossa or glenoid cavity. If we bring the humerus back in, you can see that is the articular partner for the head of the humerus. So when you abduct your arm or flex your arm, that movement, at least initially, is occurring here. We have two tubercles near the glenoid fossa, so I'm going to hide everything again. They're not very well defined on here, but you can see them. So the tip of the glenoid cavity, above the glenoid cavity, I should say, that's called the supraglenoid tubercle. Supraglenoid tubercle, and that's a muscle attachment, as is the infraglenoid tubercle below. So we have the supraglenoid tubercle and the infraglenoid tubercle, and they're named for their relationship to the glenoid fossa. Supra is above, infra is below. And that, my friends, is it for the scapula. We have another video talking about the angles and borders, but that's it for the structures of the scapula. Thanks, everybody.